Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 278, The FemaleBlondin, Part 1. Catherine Isabella Webber, known as Kate, was the FemaleBlondin. Her stage name was Ella Zuila, and she was known as the heroine of The High Wire. She also used Ella Loyal and Ella Zoila as stage names. She was the most famous Australian public entertainer in the world in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, the toast of enraptured audiences across Europe and North America. She was striking looking and had astounding physical prowess, and was in her day the world's most famous female circus wire walker and aerialist. She was a sensation. She matched and often excelled the daring feats of male aerialists. Kate was born in Sydney, Australia on the 30th of October 1854, the oldest of 3 girls, to Henry Webber and Mary Tinlin. She was only 5 and her youngest sister only 9 months old when their father died. English aerialist and human cannonball George Loyal arrived in Australia in 1868. He performed in Melbourne and Sydney, and this was no doubt where he established both a personal and professional relationship with her. George Loyal was born James George Loyal Julius Zirk on the 11th of August 1847 in Hamburg. He was 7 years older than Ella. George's first wife stated that he told her he'd been born in Rio de Janeiro. George's parents immigrated from Germany by 1852 to Adelaide. He was the second born in a large family. George had married Hannah Jones on the 16th of December 1867. Hannah had been born in Hobart, Tasmania, and was an actress and ballet performer at the time of their marriage. Once they married, Hannah assisted George in his business of a gymnastics performer. George and Hannah had 3 children, George Loyal Julius in Hobart in 1868, when Hannah went to her mother's home to give birth, Harriet Loyal Julius in Victoria in 1870, who died at 1 month old, and John Julius in Melbourne in 1871. Hannah said that shortly after the marriage, Julius began to beat her and was greatly unkind and cruel to her, and on one occasion when they lived in New Zealand, about 2 months after their marriage, he beat and bruised her on account of her expressing dislike to a certain dog which he brought to their home. He frequently, during the time that he lived with Hannah, was violent and offensive. He abused her and threatened her with violence on several occasions and assaulted and beat her without any just cause. On several occasions he left her entirely destitute of means of support, even though he was earning considerable sums of money. And Hannah said that on the occasions of her being left by him, she was compelled and obliged to resort to her mother for support of herself and the children. While living in Melbourne in January 1870, at the Theatre Comique, amongst other performers, it says Mr. George Loyal, the greatest gymnast that ever appeared in Australia. Again at the Theatre Comique, a couple of weeks later, Mr. George Loyal, the miraculous in his wonderful feats. In another, George Loyal, the eminent miraculous in his perilous acrobatic feats. And another one in March 1870, again at the Theatre Comique, Mr. George Loyal in his great feat of leaping through a fire balloon. On the 26th of March 1870 in the Telegraph, St Kilda, Paran and South Yarra Guardian, a sensational feat entirely new to the colonies is shortly to be presented to the pleasure seekers of Melbourne. It consists in travelling on a bicycle along a wire rope stretched at a considerable height, and a private performance was given with great success on Saturday by Mr. George Loyal, the well-known trapezist. The rope, which was a wire of 1/2 inch in thickness, was stretched along the body of the hall at about 6 feet from the floor, and the bicycle used was one made especially for the occasion, with grooves in the wheels to run on the rope. A specialty in the vehicle is that the wheels are reversed of those of others in general use, having a small wheel of 1 foot 8 inches in diameter in the front and a larger wheel of 2 feet 6 inches in diameter at the back. This is for the purpose of a better balancing power.
Mr. Loyal, having mounted the vehicle with great ease, propelled it backwards and forwards along the rope, maintaining his equilibrium by means of a balancing pole. The most difficult part of the trick seemed to be in stopping and then retracing his way backwards. But the performer had evidently great confidence in himself and appeared as much at home on the tightrope as an ordinary bicyclist would on terra firma. The feat is certainly a very clever one, and Mr. Loyal is quite as ready to perform at an altitude of 60 feet as at 6. The trick will no doubt attract large audiences. It's on the 6th of April 1870 in the Melbourne Argus at the Theatre Comique. This evening, the greatest novelty of the season, first time in Australia, Mr. George Loyal in his great serial bicycle feat on the high rope, the most marvellous and daring feat ever attempted by man. On the 7th of May 1870 in the Melbourne Herald at the Theatre Comique. Additional attractions are promised this evening. George Loyal and Jean Valetti will for the first time in this colony perform on the double dying trapeze, and on the 14th of May 1870 in the Melbourne Age, a grand balloon ascent is to take place from the Friendly Society's reserve on the 21st, and as an additional attraction and excitement, Mr. Gale will be accompanied by Mr. George Loyal, who will perform in mid-air on a trapeze suspended from the car of the balloon. Such at least will be the program unless the authorities intervene to prevent it, as they've done in England. And on the 18th of June 1870 in the Sydney Morning Herald, at the Albert Ground, George Loyal begs to inform the public of New South Wales that he's arranged to visit New South Wales for the purpose of performing his extraordinary aerial feat of riding a bicycle on a rope 29 feet from the ground. This miraculous feat was performed by him at the Friendly Society's ground in Melbourne on the Queen's birthday and previously at Ballarat, and produced immense excitement, being received with universal cheering. On this occasion, George Loyal will have the honour to appear in his unrivalled performances on the trapeze and horizontal bar. Prizes will be awarded for the following sports open to all: the Grand Handicap 3-mile walk, the 3/4 mile handicap flat race, and the Great Handicap bicycle race 1 mile, in which George Loyal will compete. In the Sydney Empire on the 4th of July 1870, Loyal's performance on the horizontal bar was something to see. It certainly has not been equalled in Sydney, if elsewhere. He does everything with such ease and cleverness, is so excessively quiet and undemonstrative, and withal so every way graceful in his movements, as well to merit the remark of a friend of ours that Loyal was quite the most gentlemanly as well as the cleverest performer of the kind he had ever seen. When the time for the rope exhibition came, the athlete appeared in a very handsome as well as tasteful dress, of which the upper portions was a jockey cap, and he opened the performance by walking to and fro along the rope, after which, having been blindfolded, he marched along the same perilous way forward and backward, keeping time to the music of the band, and bending on one knee at the middle of the journey. Everything being prepared, Loyal then started on his way with the bicycle along his wiry road, and when he arrived at the centre of the rope, it became clear that so great a slackening had taken place as to place him in a most dangerous fix. After trying 3 or 4 times to reach either end and not getting within a yard or more, he stopped in the centre and told the bystanders to bring a ladder that was handy. Some confusion and delay took place, causing the dangerously situated young rider to once or twice request those who had the ladder to be quick, for as he said, he couldn't stay there all day. Fortunately, however, everything turned out well. The ladder was upreared in time, and the plucky acrobat stood safe once more. Another ladder having been procured, the bicycle was lowered, and this part of the performance, which at one time bid fair to turn out disastrously, was over. It made most people nervous enough to see Loyal on the rope 20 feet from the ground, unable to dismount from the bicycle, or to advance up the incline in front or retreat up that in his rear. This having well ended, he wasn't long appearing on his flying trapeze, and perfectly electrifying those who fancied they'd seen good things in this line before. The subject of this notice performs on longer ropes by far than are usually made use of, the length of those to his swinging bars being 16 feet, and the ease and cleverness with which he does various feats on these flyers have certainly never been excelled, if equalled, in Sydney. In summing up the doings of this latest addition to our sensational performers, we may remark generally how every way worthy of support he is, for there is a superiority about his style, and a quiet confidence in that superiority that we have not met with before under similar circumstances. and we can assure the inhabitants of the different towns that young Loyal will visit that they've never had such a treat and are not likely soon to have another. We hear he intends to go to Newcastle, Goulburn, Bathurst and other leading towns where he ought to meet a great reception and put good money in his purse. On the 6th of September 1870 in the Sydney Morning Herald, George Loyal, alias Julius, appeared on summons charged with refusing to pay Peter Walsh the sum of £2 10 shillings wages due. The complainant opposed that I'm a general servant. The defendant engaged me in about middle of July. I commenced work on Tuesday the 2nd of August at Newcastle, assisting him in his occupation of riding the bicycle on a tightrope and fixing the trapeze. I remained in his employment until Friday the 22nd of August at £1 per week. He only paid me 10 shillings and promised to give me the remainder when we got to town, but from time to time when I spoke to him, he said he would pay me on a future day, but never did. I occasionally performed on the trapeze. The bench ordered the defendant to pay the amount claimed, 4 shillings £10 costs, in default 14 days imprisonment. On the 6th of May 1871 in the Ovens and Murray Advertiser of Beechworth, Burton's National Circus. The performance given by this company in Beechworth on Thursday evening was a great success. The large tent was pitched in the market reserve, and by the time the entertainment commenced, it was comfortably filled. Everything that was done was well done, and the performances from the beginning to end were highly appreciated by the audience. George Loyal and his companion gave great pleasure to the audience by their gymnastic performances, the evolutions on the horizontal bar especially eliciting marked approbation. And I did an episode on Burton's Circus, episode 263. He's quite an interesting man if you'd like to tune into that one if you haven't already. On the 10th of August 1871 in the Melbourne Argus, he's at the Theatre Royal, and the manager and the sole lessee was Mr. George Coppin. I did an episode on George Coppin on episode 265. A farewell benefit, most positively the last appearance in his great specialties in which he stands without rival for the last time in Melbourne, Mr. George Loyal in a grand sensation act. On the 9th of December 1871 in the Melbourne Herald is still at the Theatre Royal in an act called L'Echelle Suspendée. He visited Sydney in December 1871 and made the acquaintance of Catherine Webber, a girl of 18 years old, a gymnastics performer, and he entered into an agreement with Catherine Webber to perform with and for him in gymnastics for a salary. So by the 2nd of January 1872, it says in the Sydney Morning Herald that he's at the Café Chantant, George Loyal the Miraculous in his perilous journey on bicycle from stage to boxes. On the 19th of January 1872 in the Sydney Morning Herald, it says that he is at the exhibition building at a grand gala day, George Loyal and his female pupil on the high rope. So at this point we assume that it is Kate Webber. On the 24th of January 1872 in the Sydney Morning Herald is at the exhibition building and grounds, George Loyal in one of his great feats assisted by the celebrated Lulu, the only female gymnast in the colonies, in one of the greatest sensation feats ever witnessed in Australia. Lulu, the female gymnast, and all for 1 shilling. On the 26th of January 1872 in the Evening News, an Australian female gymnast. Yesterday, a private rehearsal was held by an Australian young lady gymnast. Those who saw her are loud in their praise. She performs the double trapeze with her tutor, Mr. George Loyal, with consummate ease, grace and intrepidity. She also walks forwards and backwards upon a suspended wire 50 feet long without evincing the least sign of nervousness. This young lady, Lulu, upon her first appearance, which takes place at the exhibition grounds today, will no doubt create a furore. So the assumption would be that Catherine Webber is Lulu. His first wife, knowing him as James Julius, returned to Melbourne in January 1872, and he brought with him Catherine Webber. She was introduced to his wife at her mother's house, and they lived with Hannah's mother, and Catherine Webber was treated as one of the family. In February 1872, disagreements began between Hannah and Catherine Webber, as Hannah became suspicious that there was improper intercourse occurring between her husband and Catherine Webber. She communicated her suspicions to her husband. However, James assured her that such suspicions were groundless, and he promised that he would send Catherine Webber back to her home in Sydney. However, he did not do so. Instead, he took lodgings for Catherine Webber in A. Beckett Street in Melbourne, and he frequently visited her in these lodgings. On the 17th of February 1872 in the Melbourne Herald, a grand evening gala at the Agricultural Society showgrounds on St Kilda Road. Grand moonlight balloon ascent by the celebrated aeronaut Mr Gale, Mademoiselle Zuila, from the Alhambra Palace in her wonderful feats on the high rope, including the marvellous performance of driving the bicycle in mid-air, surrounded by fireworks. Mr George Loyal with Mademoiselle Zuila on the double trapeze. Mr George Loyal in his great act entitled Zambilla Rostestration, and the great flying leaps through fire hoops and balloons. And at the same event, in another advertisement, it says that at 8:40 p.m, Mademoiselle Zuila and Mr George Loyal in their thrilling sensational acts on the double trapeze, including the great Lula leap. On the 5th of March 1872 in the Melbourne Herald at the Friendly Society's Gardens, under the patronage of His Excellency the Governor. The wonderful Madame Zuila in her astounding performances on the tightrope and double trapeze, Mr George Loyal in his wonderful performance, The Bicycle in the Air. And on the 22nd of March 1872 in the Melbourne Argus, it outlines passengers clearing out of Melbourne. And on the Massacon for Sydney, passengers in the saloon include Mrs George Loyal. The Sydney Morning Herald on the 22nd of March 1872 also carried an advertisement for Ella's performance as a gymnast the next day at the Royal National Circus in Sydney. Only 4 days earlier than this, George left Melbourne for Sydney. His wife stated that on the 18th of March 1872, George, without her consent, left her in Melbourne and without her knowledge that day departed by steam vessel for Sydney in company with Catherine Webber and afterwards lived with her in Sydney. So in the New South Wales Police Gazette on the 27th of March 1872, James Julius, alias George Loyal, charged on warrant with deserting his 2 infant children in Melbourne, leaving them without means of support, has been arrested by Detective Abbott and remanded to Melbourne. So on the 1st of April 1872 in the Melbourne Age, James Julius, alias George Loyal, a gymnast, is charged on warrant with deserting his wife and child at Carlton on the 18th. He went per the Alexandra to Sydney en route for Auckland and California in company with a female gymnast. So on the 4th of April 1872, the Ballarat Star reported that James Julius, better known under the name of George Loyal, a well-known acrobatic performer, was charged with wife desertion in the City Court this morning. It appears that the defendant, who it was stated occasionally earned as much as £15 for a single day's performance and could make £7 to £8 a week on average all year round, had recently gone to fulfil a professional engagement in Sydney, leaving his wife and 2 children entirely without means of support. It further appeared there was another lady in the case, for although Mrs Julius did not accompany the defendant to Sydney, a certain Miss Kate Webber did. The singular assertion was also made that a short time ago, while the defendant was endeavouring to instruct his wife in the art and mystery of tightrope dancing, this Miss Webber shook the rope out of malice prepense, causing Mrs Julius to fall from a height of 14 feet and thus endangering her life. For the defendant, it was contended that he had no intention to desert his wife and family. Miss Webber had merely accompanied him in a professional capacity. The bench, however, considered that the case had been proved and ordered the defendant to fine one surety in £25 and to pay his wife £1 per week. 2 days later in the Melbourne Herald, a letter to the editor, The Gymnasts. Sir, in your issue last evening, in your police report charging me with wife desertion, Mr. Stevens stated that I'd endeavoured to teach my wife to walk the tightrope and that while she was walking the wire, Kate Webber shook the rope with the intention of killing my wife. In defence of this unmanly assertion, I wish to place the bare facts before the public. In the first place, as novelty in my peculiar profession is the order of the day, I have from time to time endeavoured to introduce the latest and newest sensational performance to sit the aerial bicycle feat on the high rope, and the latest novelty being a female gymnast. I entered into an arrangement with Miss Webber's mother and engaged the girl for a term of 2 years. I may add that I trained and taught the girl to perform on the high rope and do a double trapeze with me. I brought the girl to Melbourne, having previously informed my wife of the fact. Our reception was not very brilliant at home, and in course of conversation a few days after, Mrs. Loyal asked me to learn her to walk the rope. I told her she was too weak and her nerves not sufficiently strong to admit of her the dangerous performance. I there took a company for a tour through the province, and while at Castlemaine, my wife persuaded me to allow her to practice the rope. She practiced for 2 days, an hour a day, on an inclined rope, commencing at an elevation of 2 to 8 foot. The rope was fastened from the back of the stage to the gallery, the highest part not being 12 foot, as the theatre is not high. The 3rd day of practice she would persist in crossing the highest part of the rope. I endeavoured to persuade her to not cross the pit, but she persisted. Attached to the rope were 4 guides, or rather only 2, as 2 persons hold 1 guide. Miss Rachel Jones and Miss Webber held the first one, and 2 gentlemen the other. When Mrs. Loyal crossed the guide that Miss Webber was holding, Miss Webber held it rather slack, and I held the guide myself until Mrs. Loyal passed 9 or 10 foot beyond it. When she was in the centre of the 2 guides, she then stopped walking and commenced to slack a little, and lost her balance and fell. I was under the rope at the time, but not sufficiently near to catch her in the fall. She then wished to walk the rope again, but I pulled it down. There was nothing said about the girl jerking the rope then, and I'm willing to swear on oath that the rope was not jerked, and that Mrs. Loyal fell purely through overbalance. Mr. Frank Lloyd, a comique, and Mr. Charles Taylor, both of whom were present, will bear me out with what I state. In conclusion, I beg to say that I merely write this to place the true facts before the public and clear an innocent and clever young lady from a foul and disgraceful charge. On the 10th of April 1872 in the Sydney Evening News, Loyal the Miraculous in trouble. James Julius, known to fame as George Loyal, the gymnast, was summoned in the Melbourne court charged with wife desertion. He'd been arrested on warrant in Sydney, where he had gone to fulfil a professional engagement. The wife, a young and very prepossessing, graceful girl, said that her husband could earn £7 to £8 and sometimes as much as £15 for a single performance. He'd gone to Sydney without telling her of his intentions. As soon as she discovered his absence, she followed and had him arrested on warrant. She said she was willing to live with her husband if he would cease to travel with a girl named Webber, a gymnast. For the defence, it was urged that Julius had frequently gone away on professional tours and had always contributed to his wife's support during his absence. It was further urged that he had, since he'd gone to Sydney, remitted £2 to his wife. Julius's mother said she offered to take Mrs. Julius into her house and corroborated the statement of her son as to him having sent remittance to his wife when away on previous occasions. Mr. F. Stephen, who appeared for the complainant, handed in a letter from the girl Webber to her own mother, in which the jealousy of Mrs. Julius was referred to. This letter had been found by Mrs. Julius outside the girl Webber's box. It was asserted that while Mrs. Julius was learning to walk the slack rope, the girl Webber gave the rope a shake, causing Mrs. Julius to fall 14 feet. Jealousy seems to be at the bottom of the whole affair. The judge suggested it would be much better if an amicable understanding could be come to. So on the 8th of May 1872 in the Sydney Morning Herald, it says that George Loyal was amongst talented artistes at the Café Chantant again. On the 18th of May 1872 in Sydney, an exhibition for the Queen's birthday, which included Madame Zuila, although she is perfectly aware that she's the darling of the public, has consented to show them the Great Niagara Leap and will assist George Loyal on the flying trapeze and other miraculous feats, such as flying through the air 60 feet above your head. On the 25th of May 1872 in the Sydney Morning Herald, the most startling performances in the interior of the building were those by Mr. George Loyal and a young lady designated in the program as Mademoiselle Zoila. They both performed a number of daring feats on the flying trapeze, which was suspended from one of the iron arches that support the roof. Hannah and George Loyal's son, John Julius, died in Newcastle, New South Wales on the 29th of August 1872. And Hannah said that when her son died, she had no means to pay the expense of the burial. She telegrammed George Loyal, who was residing at Sydney and who was in regular and lucrative employment, to beg for money for the burial of the child and refused to make any provision for the expenses of burying him. Meanwhile, there's advertisements from Sydney on the 16th of August 1872 at the Theatre Royal. George Loyal and Mademoiselle Zuila's Comets, complimentary benefits. Sensation tonight. Come and see Mademoiselle Zoila cross York Street on the high rope from building to building at 7:30. Come and see this lovely lady in her thrilling act. George Loyal will perform the perilous feat of walking on the ceiling at 9:15. The spectators during this hazardous feat are requested to remain in breathless silence. Zuila on the slack rope tonight for the first time. Come and see this daring lady. It is marvellous. She is daring. Mademoiselle Zuila on the slack rope. This lovely lady is unequalled in the world. George Loyal, the miraculous, tonight on the horizontal bar. And only 6 days after the burial of his son, on the 5th of September 1872 in the Sydney Morning Herald, the Theatre Royal in York Street, the last night of 8 of Loyal, Zuila, Comet and Valetti. George Loyal every evening on the slack rope, throwing double somersault 40 foot in the air, received every night with thunders of applause. In April 1872, Hannah believed that George Loyal continually travelled, lived and cohabited with Catherine Webber as his wife in several colonies, including New South Wales, New Zealand, Victoria, Queensland and South Australia, and that she believed that he frequently committed adultery with Catherine Webber. She believed that they lived as man and wife from the 22nd of May 1874 and during May under the names of Mr. and Mrs. George Loyal. On the 25th of October 1872 in the Sydney Evening News, George Loyal and Madame Zuila are performing at Grahamstown in New Zealand. The takings are £50 a night. On the 24th of February 1873 in the Sydney Morning Herald, they're back at the Theatre Royal. Mr. George Loyal's miraculous act of the bicycle on the wire rope. Zuila, Queen of the Air, the miraculous, the intrepid and the fearless, she's a living wonder of the 19th century. George Loyal on his bicycle, mid-air performer, Trapezian artist. On the 9th of May 1873 in Sydney at the St Patrick's Day celebration, Loyal versus Horan. We, the undersigned, wish to draw the attention of the public to report a case in the District Court in which a report stated that the celebration committee repudiated an engagement made with the plaintiff, George Loyal, and refused to pay him for services rendered at the exhibition building on St Patrick's Day. No engagement was made by the committee with Mr. Loyal, and furthermore he gave no performance at the exhibition on the day in question, and the statement made by Mr. Horan that the committee had not paid over 1 shilling of the proceeds was made without he being in a position to know whether they did or did not. So interestingly, only a fortnight later, they're in South Australia. Grand gigantic Roman hippodrome, greatest open-air fete ever presented to the Australian public. Madame Zuila, Queen of the Air, and George Loyal the Miraculous in their extraordinary performances on the aerial bicycle, first time in South Australia. And then on the 21st of June 1873 in the Adelaide Observer, at the Hippodrome, Mr. George Loyal's appearance upon the tightrope was thrilling in its character, though somewhat of the interest was taken from the event by Mademoiselle Zuila, the aerial queen, not appearing. We're rather inclined to applaud the Queen of the Air for her judgment, inasmuch as there was too much air stirring in the shape of the wind to allow her to take up a loft to be a safe one. Loyal walked along the tightrope, which was between 20 and 30 feet above the ground, blindfolded, and then proceeded over 3/4 of the length and back again on a bicycle. He, of course, carried the balance pole in both instances, but still deserves great credit for the feat. Then by the 28th of July 1873, they're back at the Theatre Royal in Sydney. George Loyal and Mademoiselle Zuila will reappear for a short season commencing Saturday. On the 28th of October 1873, the gymnasts George Loyal and Zoila are going to Melbourne. On the 11th of November 1873 in the Sydney Morning Herald at the exhibition building, Madame Zuila and George Loyal performed a series of very daring acts on the trapeze, high above the heads of the spectators on the ground floor, and 1 or 2 of the feats in which Madame Zuila appeared in the act of falling drew forth an involuntary exclamation of terror from many who looked upon the performance. On the 31st of December 1873 in the Sydney Morning Herald, at the exhibition building, Loyal's extraordinary aerial feat, George Loyal and Naira in the double trapeze. On the 4th of February 1874 in the Brisbane Courier in Queensland, an advertisement in another column announces that the Loyals will shortly appear. Mr. George Loyal and his brothers, with a lady, Mademoiselle Zuila, have been creating a sensation in New Zealand and the southern colonies as gymnasts of unusual daring and expertness. No doubt they'll find a large and appreciative audience in Brisbane to welcome them when they make their appearance. And on the 12th of March 1874, in the Maryborough Chronicle and Wide Bay and Burnett Advertiser, at the Temperance Hall on Friday night, Owing to the detention of the Northern steamer until Saturday morning, the Loyal troop will have one more opportunity of appearing in Maryborough. On this occasion, the sisters, Zuila and Naira, will take a benefit, and we may be sure they'll do their utmost to make, if possible, even a more favourable impression than they've already achieved in Maryborough. Among other novelties, Mr. George Loyal will walk on the ceiling, head downwards, in defiance of all laws of gravitation. Having seen Mr. Loyal on the bicycle and learnt how faithfully this company carry out their program, we're quite prepared to see him successfully accomplish this new sensation. We heartily hope that the company's liberality in devoting the proceeds realised this evening to the hospital will not prevent them from having a bumper house tomorrow. The company have played to crowded houses every night they've shown in Maryborough, and the public opinion has been unanimous that they are by far the cleverest company that have yet visited us. In part 2, I'll be covering what George Loyal and Catherine Webber do. Do they continue with their relationship, both professional and personal? And what became of the descendants of George Loyal and Catherine Webber?
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.